The pencil rests on the desk, but the fingers holding it have gone completely still. The first question on the page is one you studied last night, right before turning off the light. You know you saw the answer. You can almost picture the shape of the paragraph it was in, but the space beneath the question remains empty, as if the memory has vanished into a fog. Your heart is pounding hard now, your hands are damp, and the silence of the room feels enormous. This moment has a name. It is called the blank at the critical moment, but a name does not explain why it happens. The simple explanation is that stress shuts down your memory, stage fright freezes you, and that is the end of the story. Except the story is more complicated, because sometimes stress does the exact opposite. The same nervous energy that empties your mind now once helped you remember a frightening event with impossible clarity. Why would the same response both sharpen recall and wipe it out completely? To understand that, we must follow the question backward, from the exam hall to the quiet night before. The answer will change not only what you think about forgetting, but what you believe stress is actually doing inside your mind. Stress is not simply a feeling of worry. It is a full-body response designed to prepare you for a challenge. This response evolved to help our ancestors meet physical dangers, a predator, a sudden fall, not to help them write a timed essay. But the same biological machinery switches on whether the threat is a charging animal or a question you cannot answer. For decades, scientists have observed a curious pattern. Performance does not simply fall as stress rises. Instead, it follows an upside-down, U-shaped curve, first described more than a century ago. When you feel almost no stress at all, you might not focus well enough to perform at your best. A moderate amount of stress sharpens attention, makes information feel more relevant, and can actually boost memory. That is why a little nervousness before a test can help you concentrate, while too much sends you into the blank zone. The student who went blank at the exam probably crossed from the beneficial peak into the steep downward slope of that curve. But the shape of the curve only describes the surface. It does not reveal what happens inside the memory machinery. Memory is not one single vault in the brain, but a collection of different systems that handle different kinds of information. There is memory for facts and concepts, memory for personal experiences, and memory for procedures like riding a bicycle. Stress does not treat all these memory systems equally. In fact, stress can carve out one kind of memory with startling clarity while smothering another. This selective effect is the first clue that forgetting under pressure is not a total failure. It is a shift in priorities. To see how this shift works, we need to look separately at what happens when stress enters during learning and when it enters during recall. Our student studied late at night, perhaps with a low but steady hum of anxiety about tomorrow. That background stress was already changing the way new information was being filed away. The blank at the exam may have been built, in part, many hours before the pencil stopped moving. Memory formation happens in stages. First, you encode an experience, then you consolidate it into a stable form, and later you retrieve it. Stress can influence each stage differently, like changing the recipes at different steps of baking a cake. When you learn something while your stress response is strongly activated, the brain prioritizes the emotional core of the experience. That is why people can vividly recall where they were during a shocking event, yet forget a fact they studied the same week. This strengthening works through a small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala helps stamp certain memories as high priority, while the hippocampus tries to weave together the many details of the episode. But under high stress, the balance tips, the amygdala's stamp becomes louder, and the hippocampus's detailed weaving becomes rougher. When our students spent the semester in constant worry, the very tool needed for precise fact learning may have become dulled. So by the time of the final exam, The information may never have been stored in a robust, easily reached form. Now let us move to the moment of retrieval itself, when you try to pull a memory back out. Here, too, stress plays a double role that can seem baffling. A sudden, acute burst of stress right before you recall something can sometimes help, especially if the memory itself is emotional. But if the stress is too intense, or if the memory is a neutral fact like a math formula, retrieval often gets blocked. The blocking is not random. Scientists believe that high cortisol levels temporarily impair the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that helps you focus and search for the right information. At the same time, the brain's alarm system stays active, scanning for threats, rather than devoting energy to quiet, precise recall. Every second that passes with no answer deepens the alarm, which raises the stress further, which tightens the blockade. This is the vicious spiral. The feeling of blankness creates fear, and the fear makes it even harder to break through. Psychologists have long noticed that recall is easier when the conditions at retrieval match the conditions during learning. If you learn a fact while sipping tea in a quiet room, you might remember it better when you are again in a quiet, relaxed state. Our student, however, learned the material in a quiet bedroom, but must retrieve it in a brightly lit, tense exam hall with a racing pulse. This combination does not mean the memory is destroyed. It means the memory, for this moment, is locked in a room to which the brain refuses to give a key. If all of this sounds like a flaw, consider the possibility that the system is not broken. It is built for a different kind of world. For a hunter-gatherer ancestor, remembering the exact wording of a legal code was less urgent than remembering the location of water during a drought. Stress evolved to prioritize memories that have survival value: the face of a predator, the taste of a poisonous plant, the path to safety. In that ancient environment, the ability to scan for danger and keep a broad alertness was worth more than accurate recall of neutral details. When the exam paper triggers the same ancient alarm, the brain makes a trade-off. It heightens vigilance and suppresses precise declarative search. The blank page, then, is not a personal failure of courage or intelligence. It is the cost of a biological design that was never optimized for modern classrooms. The real reversal, however, comes from what happens after the immediate pressure lifts. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. The moment you step outside the exam room, the forgotten answer suddenly springs to mind. The disappearance of the threat allows the stress hormones to clear, and the prefrontal cortex resumes its ordinary function. The memory was there all along, but it was sealed off by a chemical blockade that kept you in survival mode. Recognition of this fact changes how we might respond to the blank in the moment. Fighting the stress with commands like "just calm down" rarely works, because it only adds another layer of pressure. Instead, taking a slow breath and briefly looking away can signal to the body that there is no immediate physical danger. That small pause does not erase the stress, but it can reduce the blockade enough for the memory to slip through. Here is the central insight. Stress is not a simple dimmer switch that makes memory brighter or darker. It is a reprioritization system that decides, in a fraction of a second, what kind of information is most important for your survival right now. The blank during a test is not evidence that you learned nothing. It is evidence that your brain believes, wrongly in this setting, that a state of high alert is more useful than careful retrieval. The student who sat frozen at the desk was not missing the memory because it was weak or lost. The memory was simply waiting, held behind a gate that would only open when the brain's threat assessment dropped. Understanding this can transform the blank from a terrifying mystery into a predictable, manageable event. It also explains why some people find that practicing retrieval under mild stress, like timed quizzes, can make the real test feel more familiar and less threatening. In that light, the blank is not the end of the story. It is a signal to adjust the relationship between learning, stress, and the environment. Now return to the quiet night before the exam, where our story began. The student sitting with open notes, replaying fears about the next day, was not just reviewing facts. The student was encoding those facts in a state of mild but persistent stress, mixed with fragments of hope. That mixture shaped the memory into a form that would later be hard to reach under peak pressure. But the story did not end at the blank page. Later that afternoon, walking home, the student stops in the middle of the sidewalk and whispers the answer out loud, the one that would not come during the test. The release is quiet, but it confirms what the science suggests. The memory was always present, and stress had only made it inaccessible. This does not erase the consequence of the missed question, but it does offer a more hopeful view of your own mind. You can prepare for high-stakes recall not by eliminating stress, because that is impossible, but by practicing retrieval in varied emotional states. You can also learn to see a brief mental block as a physiological signal rather than a judgment on your ability. A pause, a slow exhale, and a decision to move to the next question can sometimes disarm the spiral. The larger lesson is about the partnership between emotion and memory. The systems that sometimes fail us during a test are the same systems that let us recall a kind face years later, or the rules of a dangerous crossing. They are not designed for perfect academic recall. They are designed for living through a complex, unpredictable world. What felt like forgetting was the brain choosing a different priority, and recognizing that choice is the first step toward making the system work a little more in your favor.